January 31st, 1945, Clark Air Base, Luzon, Philippines. Major Frank T. McCoy stood in the brutal tropical light, camera steady in his hands despite a slight tremor, as he photographed an unusual prize, an intact Mitsubishi G4M, the bomber Allied crews would call Betty, marked with tail number 76312. This was not a mangled wreck pulled from a cratered field. It sat whole on its tricycle gear, its long cylindrical fuselage shining like a metal cigar, wings outstretched and undamaged, twin radial engines silent but unmarred. Yet what made McCoy's jaw drop was a discovery through the wing inspection panels. The fuel tanks were bare, thin sheets of aluminum, holding thousands of liters of high-octane fuel with no rubber lining, no self-sealing compound, no armor, and no fire suppression systems of consequence. In place of protective layers, there was maybe a couple of millimeters of skin between raging fuel and enemy tracer fire. For the commander of the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit in the Southwest Pacific, who had examined scores of Japanese wrecks, this pristine example stripped away any doubt. This vulnerability was deliberate, not an accident. What McCoy found would force Allied engineers and tacticians to recalculate their assumptions about Japanese aircraft design, and it would explain why crews and planes burned so readily in combat. To understand the shock, you have to go back 4 years. On December 8, 1941, while smoke still rose over Pearl Harbor, twin-engine G4Ms, alongside older G3M models, launched from Formosa and swept toward Clark Field. High above anti-aircraft reach at about 20,000 feet, 27 bombers of that first wave released, 636 bombs against runways and hangars. Moments later, nimble Zero fighters swooped in at treetop level and finished what the bombing had begun. The result was devastation. Heavy bombers and pursuit aircraft on the ground were converted to burning ruins in under an hour. Lieutenant James Harrington, one of the rare pilots who survived, later described the sight with a single, stunned observation. They came in perfect formation, high and untouchable. Then the fighters dove and tore us apart. The Bettys themselves left the field intact, demonstrating a strategic reach that American bombers at the time simply could not match. That range mattered. 2 days after Clark, on December 10, 1941, 26 G4Ms joined a strike that would sink the battleship Prince of Wales and the battle cruiser Repulse, flying coordinated torpedo attacks with deadly precision. The Japanese aircraft used Type 91 aerial torpedoes designed for shallow water, and within hours those two capital ships, symbols of British naval might, capsized and sank, taking 841 sailors with them. The episode was a historic turning point. For the first time, heavily defended capital ships in the open sea had been sunk exclusively by air attack. Across the early months of the Pacific Campaign, the Betty's long legs allowed it to attack Darwin, Port Moresby, Guadalcanal, and scores of other objectives from bases that Allied planners thought safe. Where Allied fighters could not follow, the G4M could strike and return. In these opening phases, with Allied air opposition thin or out of position, the Betty's combination of range, speed and payload was devastatingly effective, but that effectiveness was conditional. The G4M's design choices were the result of explicit priorities: to maximize range and speed at almost any cost. Allied intelligence and later on-the-ground examinations would reveal why. Early in the war, the Bettys appeared invincible simply because interception opportunities were few. Once Allied fighter strength increased and doctrine adapted, the aircraft's weaknesses were ruthlessly exposed. The turning point came in mid-1942, as newer, longer-legged Allied fighters and better-trained pilots entered combat. The G4M began to suffer catastrophic losses. On August 8, 1942, 23 G4Ms of the 4th Air Group launched toward Guadalcanal and were met by American fighters over Tasavo Island. 18 of those 23 were shot down and roughly 120 aviators were killed. After that mission, the bomber's terrible reputation for igniting with only minor hits became a grim fact of life in Pacific skies. Pilots who faced them coined macabre nicknames: the Flying Cigar, the 1-liter, the Zippo, references to an aircraft that seemed to burst into flame from the smallest puncture. The story behind that vulnerability emerged, slowly but inevitably, after Allied forces captured Buna in Papua New Guinea in late 1942. Technicians from the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit found intact G4Ms and began a forensic process that confirmed pilot reports. Under access panels, engineers peered into fuel cells that had no self-sealing rubber, no protective coatings and no armor around them, just thin aluminum skin. This was not field repair or battle damage. It was standard practice. American bombers and fighters had long since adopted self-sealing tanks, armor plating, and fire suppression precisely because the trade-in, added weight for crew survivability, had proven essential. The United States accepted the weight penalty. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators carried armored bulkheads, plated pilot seats, and layered fuel tanks that swelled to seal holes. The result was heavier aircraft, but crews that survived far more often once their planes were hit. Japanese engineers and naval planners, however, had come to different conclusions. Meet the Imperial Navy's late 1930s. Specification: demanding, unprecedented range so bombers could project power across the vast Pacific. Mitsubishi's design team, led by Kiro Honjo after Joji Hattori's tenure, made weight economy the overriding priority. Fuel is heavy, nearly 0.8 kilo per liter, meaning thousands of liters quickly add up to carry the fuel needed to reach islands, bases, and sea lanes that were hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away. The designers stripped everything unnecessary from the airframe. Protection systems were heavy, self-sealing tanks, armor plating, redundant systems, and significant fire suppression would have driven the empty weight up, costing either range, speed, or bomb load, the very characteristics the Navy demanded. Honjo understood the trade-offs. He and his team calculated them and chose range. The result was the G4M, prototype's maiden flight in October 1939, and a production bomber that met or exceeded the Navy's targets for speed, payload, and astonishing range. Early production G4M Model 1s entered service in time to shape the first months of the Pacific War. Those engineering choices delivered an aircraft with extraordinary specifications for its time, a light empty weight relative to its size, top speeds in excess of 400 km/h, and a maximum range that could exceed 6,000 kilometers in certain configurations, among the longest of any contemporary bomber. Yet all that reach depended on thin margins for survival. The G4M Model 1 carried fuel in 8 tanks totaling roughly 4,780 liters, placed in the thickest parts of the wing to maximize capacity. But maximizing capacity also placed tanks directly in harm's way. Enemy fire from fighters attacking from below, or the side would traverse the wing and strike the tanks. American engineers later quantified the payoff, saving more than 500 kilograms per aircraft in protective systems, translated directly into fuel and range. But it also created a single catastrophic failure point. Combat reports repeatedly showed that hits around the wing or fuselage would lead quickly to uncontrollable fires and total loss. Japan's early gains, attacks from unexpected distances, crippling blows to airfields and ships, masked the fatal flaw of that choice. When Allied air power was sparse or slow to respond, the Betty was a terrifying instrument. When interception became routine, it became a death trap. Guadalcanal's long and bitter air campaign in 1942 made that clear. Repeated missions from Rabaul to Guadalcanal, ranges in which the Betty was expected to operate, turned into a brutal pattern of attrition. Entire groups were ground down. The 4th Air Group was nearly wiped out after successive missions in August. By late 1942 and into 1943, Japanese units suffered losses they could not replace. Aircraft and trained crews burned in ways that suggested there was little margin for rescue or recovery. Attempts to mitigate the vulnerability were incremental and too late. In March 1943, Mitsubishi began fitting 30mm rubber sheets under wing surfaces around tank locations on some production runs, a stopgap that added modest weight, shaved a few kilometers per hour off top speed, and reduced range slightly, but did not meaningfully prevent large caliber hits or tracer-induced explosions. Only in late 1944 did a genuine Model 3 variant appear with proper self-sealing tanks, but such examples numbered only in the dozens before the war ended. The modification cut range dramatically and arrived far too late to alter the course of combat. The Betty's weakness also played a decisive role in some of the war's most famous episodes. In April 1943, Allied codebreakers intercepted messages about Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's movements, a precision mission of P-38. Lightnings navigated hundreds of miles at wave-top altitude to intercept Yamamoto's transport. When the American fighters found the Japanese formation, hits to the lead Betty, the one carrying the Admiral, set it ablaze. It crashed, and Yamamoto died from injuries sustained in the wreck. The operation showcased Allied signals intelligence and extraordinary navigation, but it also underlined an ugly truth. Once the G4M was accurately targeted, survival was unlikely. Later, in March 1945, an operation that epitomized desperation showed the same fatal pattern. 18 G4Ms took off from Koryo Air Base, each carrying an MXY-7 Oka-piloted rocket bomb beneath the fuselage. The Bettys had to approach dangerously close to ship targets to launch the Okas, but American radar and fighters intercepted them far from release range. The G4Ms, laden and slow, were shot down one after another, exploding and plunging into the sea long before any Oka could be launched. Not a single piloted rocket reached its target. 137 G4M crew and 15 Oka pilots were lost. The mission was a tragic demonstration that an aircraft optimized for range could not survive in a contested environment. By war's end, the Betty's service life had come full circle. On August 19, 1945, 4 days after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, 2 white-painted G4M transports, the G6M conversions of the bomber design, flew under Allied escort carrying Japanese envoys to surrender negotiations. The aircraft that had opened the Pacific War at Clark Field now bore green crosses and represented Japan's capitulation, symbolically the bomber that had once shredded. American air power in the Philippines now flew peace missions under watchful escort. The circle of history complete. Production and loss figures tell the larger tragedy. Mitsubishi factories turned out some T400 T435 G4M airframes across all variants and conversions during the conflict, with early Model 1s and subsequent Model 2s making up the majority. The Model 1, light, long-legged and unprotected, numbered in the thousands early in the war and carried the original large fuel capacity near 4,080 liters. Later Model 2s pushed fuel capacity even higher in an effort to extend range. The Model 3 with self-sealing tanks appeared only in limited numbers late in 1944 and into 1945 and reduced fuel capacity and maximum reach significantly. Operational attrition was relentless. By August 1945, only a handful of serviceable Bettys remained. Tens of thousands of flight hours, countless missions, and a catastrophic tally of lost crews were the bitter measures of the aircraft's wartime record, where Allied designs placed armor, redundancy, and self-sealing tanks high on the priority list, accepting heavier empty weights in return for survivability. The Imperial Navy's mandate prioritized reach above all. American doctrine treated trained aircrew as invaluable assets, building heavier, better protected aircraft and relying on unmatched industrial capacity to replace machines. Japanese doctrine, constrained by strategic needs and industrial limits, accepted far higher crew risk in exchange for mission range. The human cost of that decision was immense. Survivors and veterans put the moral of the Betty story in blunt terms. Flight Petty Officer Masuato, who flew dozens of missions before being reassigned, summed up the bitterness. The G4M was a magnificent airplane that essentially asked its crews to risk everything for range. Crews climbed aboard because they were ordered to. Too many never returned. Engineers in Nagoya had known the trade-offs when they designed the aircraft in the late 1930s. They had calculated fuel weights, structural requirements, and the penalties of protection. They judged, within the technological and strategic constraints of E-1937-1938, that the only feasible way to meet the Navy's long-range demands was to sacrifice protection. That decision made technical sense in a narrow engineering frame. But when the war turned into a prolonged, industrialized contest, it proved fatal. The G4M's legacy is therefore double-edged. It demonstrated Japanese ingenuity in achieving long-range performance from a relatively light airframe, and it delivered early strategic victories that changed the face of naval warfare. At the same time, it became a stark symbol of how an acceptable trade-off in one era can become a catastrophic liability in another. The unprotected fuel tanks in tail number 76312 at Clark Field were not a production error. They were the visible proof of a doctrine that valued reach over life. When Allied technicians dismantled that plane and catalogued its systems, they were not merely collecting data. They were holding in their hands the arithmetic of a strategic choice that cost thousands of men their lives. The Betty thus stands in history as both an engineering achievement and a sobering lesson. Performance gained by removing protection can turn weapons into coffins for their crews, and in the end, the nation that chose to preserve human life in its design built a force that could endure. The nation that prioritized capability at the price of survivability found itself hollowed out by attrition. In that calculus lies the story of why the Mitsubishi G4M helped open the Pacific War, and why over time it became one of the reasons Japan could not sustain it.